Hello, hello. It tells me I'm streaming right now. As usual, I'm going to confirm that on my phone. And then. Let's see. Aha! It says I'm going. So, hello. Welcome to our Week 6 lecture in Kent State University's Games for Education course. Today, our discussion is on structures and production methodologies for game development. I usually give a content list at the beginning of lectures, but today I'm going to run right into it. So today, our talk is on game production. It's a fairly big topic, so, buckle up, maybe do this a few listening sessions for yourself. But I'm going to try to get through it pretty quickly. Now, before we get started, I'm going to tell you that the majority of the content in this lecture, now a lot of it's coming from personal experience because I've done this before many times. In a structured and ineffective, but also structured and effective ways. And the structured and effective ways have a lot in common with the content of your textbook for this course, Richard Lemarchand's A Playful Production Process. So a lot of the content, that's not coming from my own work in game development is coming from this book. Please refer to the book for more details because I can only cover so much. This book covers everything in much more detail, so make sure you read it. So today we're going to talk about some phases of game development. We've covered phase 1 ideation in a previous lecture, but we're going to look over it again, and then we're also going to look more deeply into the phases of pre-production and full production, because these are things that a lot of students and new game developers are not really familiar with in a formal sense. They might have heard of phrases like alpha or beta, but they don't quite know what that is. And even for game developers, that can be kind of confusing because at times it can seem very much like what is an alpha may vary from studio to studio. So, we're gonna look at some definitions there. But also we want to look at this because, and especially for those who are watching that are students that are my students, or students in other programs, because I make this available on YouTube. People don't like group work. As students especially don't like group work, but you've heard me talk about this. What do you think you do when you get into real studios? And the key to effective group work is, there's a lot of personality factors that come into this. So, this isn't like a silver bullet by any stretch of the imagination, but well-structured game development processes can help. I should also mention, and I don't think I have a slide for this, but I will try to name drop tools that can help with some of these processes along the way. So please make sure to check those out. I also have another lecture on my channel that I can put in this playlist that is about distance collaboration for game developers. Even if you're working in the same space as your fellow developers, some of the tools carry over between like distance collaboration and in-person collaboration. So, I will try to make that available. So, that lecture has demonstrations of tools like Trello and, version control. In that one, it's via a Git solution. A Git-based solution, but there are lots of different things like SVN and Perforce and things like that. But we're going to get into it. We'll get into that as we go along. So first of all, remember from previous lectures this idea of ideation, which is phase one. That's where you want to think openly and you want to spit out lots and lots of ideas so that you can effectively, this is like when creativity is like at its most free and uninhibited. This is where a lot of young designers really prefer to spend their time because this is when it's so exciting, but there's not really like limitations yet. So this is where you want to practice things like blue sky thinking, brainstorming, but also, the things that people don't realize are also part of this ideation process are things like research, figuring out what your project is really going to be about, figuring out if there's any precedents or influences that your project can have, or even just doing the research of figuring out like what your tools might be. Also prototyping and then setting project and design goals. People don't think that prototyping before you sit down with your game engine is really a thing, but it actually is a very big impactor of how your work on the computer is going to go. So you're not really you're really not going to pick your engine or your technology until you start prototyping. You should try to leave assumptions of technology, unless your project is specifically about technology. It has to be on a mobile phone and cannot be anything else, for example. Unless your project is something like that, you really should not try to choose an engine or any type of game making tool until you've prototyped a few things, and then that will tell you like, oh, this is the kind of thing that Unity would make super easy, or Unreal would really help us with this, or God, those huge engines would be a nightmare to try to build this in because there are so many just like simple mechanics. Why don't we just build it in Construct? And then the big engines won't get in our way. There's lots that you can do in prototyping that'll help you figure that out. And that'll help you set your project goals. Now, remember, we are working in transformational games this semester. So, a tool for ideation that I really like, and you've heard me say this before, is the transformational framework from Shell Games. This is part of the textbook for the course, which is called the Transformational Framework. It's available for free on the website for Carnegie Mellon's ETC Press in PDF form. You can also buy a book version for like $20, but the book uses a color-coded organization system, and the book, if you buy the print copy, it's printed in black and white. So find other ways to contribute to that awesome university press, but don't buy that book because it ruins the user experience a little bit. So the transformational framework is a framework that is going to make you answer questions about your project you may not have thought about. Like, who is your audience? What are the barriers to understanding the thing you want them to learn by playing your game, and so on. We've covered this in other lectures, so please go look at those. But this is a good tool for these research steps in your ideation process. This kind of helps you come up with your project goals, which are one of the deliverables of the ideation part of development. And again, research, I did a whole lecture on this, but, things to remember, Wikipedia, use Wikipedia. Game developers often take field trips if their game is about a site or a place, or if it evokes the feeling of a site or a place. My go-to example there is like the Assassin's Creed series. They often take field trips to the places that... Now, this is what you can do when you're a massive studio like Ubisoft. But should we all have the absurd opulence of AAA studios? But you can take field trips if your game is about something. This semester, at the time of this recording, one of the groups is working on a game that is meant to try to get people out to a local national park, the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. And, they have taken field trips to the park. so that they can kind of experience it and find if there are, cool things that should be highlighted. That kind of stuff can really help you engage the topic of your game better if it's available. Interviews with intended audience, that might take the form of focus groups, or it might be more informal. Again, if you're making transformational games, you could go talk to people in the neighborhood you're trying to help, or in the social group, etc. And then, again, look at libraries. Kent State has a wonderful university library research database, as do many universities, so please take advantage of those. Your librarians will love you. But we talked about this a bit. So where does this research go? And this is kind of new. Research, all this research step, basically like taking your blue sky thinking and trying to turn it into actionable ideas and confirm whether or not your blue sky thinking has some legs. It can go into game design documents. It can inform the way that your game design is carried out. It can help you build sort of a style guide. So here, for example, I'm making my game Little Nemo and the Nightmare Fiends, and we took a lot of our research about the art style of the original Little Nemo and Slumberland comics from 1905 and turned them into a big style guide. And that helped us understand how to draw like Winsor McCay, incorporating historical elements that he would have used and been exposed to. So all of that was from our research and went into something actually actionable as a guide for how to make elements of the game. That design document took the form of a design wiki because, for something that big, we preferred to have it as a wiki rather than as, just a giant Google document or something like that would be harder to navigate. You might have these things take the form of wireframes, which are, draft versions of an interface, that you use to design something like a mobile game or, really like interfaces on any type of game. But wireframes in the mobile space especially have a lot of power because those games are so interface heavy. That can go into concept art. If you research a culture that you find you want to evoke with the characters' dress and designs, that can be a case where that fashion might find its way into concept art. And research might also find its way into prototypes. Again, talking about my project, we spent a lot of time once we researched the art style of Winsor McCay and the original Little Nemo comics doing art prototypes. So apart from gameplay prototypes, we spent a lot of time prototyping how the art would work in a functional way so that we could build this sort of motion comic, living comic world that we wanted, because we wanted it to really look like a comic strip brought to life. So segueing into prototyping itself, so first of all, prototypes are early versions of your idea in digital and non-digital format. Now, this is where a lot of, I think, young designers get caught up because it'll be like, we should make a game. Immediately clicks open Unreal on their desktop without thinking about why are you clicking Unreal? I've had students in the past who might have had a project where they were assigned to make a 2D, very small, simple retro game, and they immediately click open Unreal. And what happens when they do that is they really struggle because Unreal is not built for that kind of game. It doesn't do that very well. And I'm not saying that in an abstract sense. They once had a set of 2D tools, and I'm not smack talking Unreal because I don't like it. I'm just saying this is its limitation. They once had ambitions to do a nice set of 2D tools, and then just kind of gave up. And I get it. That's not what Unreal's thing is. Unreal's thing is the high in graphical intensity 3D stuff. That's its like bread and butter. So in that case, that's a good example of like why you wouldn't just like default to clicking open that in that case. You could click open Unity, but even then, Unity is like kind of a pain in the neck sometimes. And I say that as like somebody who's been making Unity games for a long time. That makes me know that it's kind of a pain in the neck sometimes, even more. But that assumption of like, oh, I'm just going to click open my engine, that can be very destructive. Because you might get yourself in a situation where instead of making your game, you find yourself fighting the engine more. So this is what prototyping helps us do. This helps us get game ideas on paper, on like a table in front of us. Really in front of us is the big thing. As soon as humanly possible. Because, the temptation is always to like create the perfect document, to create the perfect design document. Have all of the things in your game listed out and balanced and all this stuff on paper. But you never actually like put it in front of you. And I hear this a lot from young designers. Oh, I've been working on this game for 4 years. This is going to be my opus. I've been working on it for 4 years. Oh, cool. What state's it in? Oh, it's this set of notes. It ain't real until it's in front of you. I read an article by a really well-known indie game developer yesterday that said, making a game is really just making a really cool folder on your computer until you like have a plan to make that folder into something that somebody can buy. And this is step one in that. So how do we get the ideas out of the documents, out of our brains, and onto paper? Sketch your ideas, sketch them on paper, because once you actually have to, I did this with my Game Boy game. I would, if I had an idea for a level or a room, I would immediately put it on graph paper. And suddenly, once I was working with the limitations of the, actual tiles, the 20 by 18, yeah, that sounds right, tiles that you would have, 8 by 8 tiles that you would have on a Game Boy screen, suddenly it was like, oh, I can't make this room. I can't have this room have all these things in it. So I would like sketch it out. And then once I sketched it out, I would put it into, in this case, I would put it into the engine as a digital prototype so that I would be able to say, all right, now, okay, I made it work visually and within the right amount of tiles, but now can I have all my ideas work with the amount of pieces in the scene? Even earlier than that, you might not even want to make, go to digital so fast. That's a level for a game already in full production. You might going backwards to even come up with like the right mechanics. I might make a tabletop or board game version of the game before I even try to commit it to any kind of code. Because that's where you might look at it and say, oh, this really should be a GB Studio game, a Twine game, something like that. So this gets your ideas out of your brain and into working form early so you can test them and see if your mechanics are even workable and interesting. I have in my game prototyping course, students practice this by reverse engineering a video game into a tabletop experience. And it's not the full game, it's usually like a piece of this. This is a Metroid Dread prototype where they took the zones where you're hunted and by the Emmy robots and turned it into like a board game where robots chase you. So, again, we don't like to use the word fun in this course because games can have other emotional cores, but I am going to use it in this case. I'm going to make an exception for myself. This is where you find the fun and kill the unfun. And prototyping is where you're going to be able to do that better than, again, if you're like fighting with some like weird, funky, goofy piece of software. So here are some tips on prototyping from one of the level designers on Marvel's Spider-Man. from his 2019 GDC Level Design Workshop talk. Try things quickly. Again, the point is not to get started on your final thing. Do things in stuff that's going to get in your way less. So tabletop will get in your way less, more often than digital will. So digital prototypes, or paper prototypes, are great ways to learn things about your eventual digital game. Also, don't be afraid to try building things in different engines before you put them into the final engine. So, I've seen people prototype the user interface for their game in Twine because it works really well and it's fast, and you don't have to worry about actually like messing with Unity's Canvas system or something. You could just kind of be like, is it intuitive to click on this kind of thing? Boop, 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 boop. And then you kind of see the flow of screens, and you can put it in front of somebody and see like, can they find their way into the game? Things like that. So something like that's really low effort to build things in is a great prototyping tool that you can eventually then, you can take the design implications of that, not have to worry about fighting with the engine itself, and then learn about what your interface will finally be, and then put it into the final piece of software. Don't be afraid to throw away. That's why you make things quick, because if it doesn't work, you can scrap it without feeling bad about it. The problem with making something really big, really fast, and jumping into like the big, scary, work-intensive thing is that it will become your darling. And you'll hear a lot the phrase, you'll hear a darker version of this phrase, but like the nicer version is, kill your darlings. You're going to have to kill your darlings a lot in game development, but this will kill bad ideas before they become your darlings. And then again, work in physical. So what are some examples of this? So types of game prototypes include playful prototyping, which are non-structured prototypes. This is like the idea of how do we want things to function? Can we make just like use little toys and things like that to visualize how we want something to work in our game? So if you need a good example, what he's holding there, because remember he worked on Marvel's Spider-Man, is he got a Spider-Man action figure and put it on a string and swung it around. And that's literally what the programmers and the developers did to understand, well, how much spatially does a swing compare to the actual like body metrics of Spider-Man? And think about that. Like you could spend a ton of time laboring over a physics prototype to even start to begin to answer those questions, or you can use physics, like real physics, and then you can look at Spider-Man swinging on a string, and you'd be like, oh, Spider-Man moves roughly 6 Spider-Mans ahead when he swings in this way. And if you're sitting there like, well, that's silly. No, this guy worked on Marvel Spider-Man for the PlayStation 4 and 5. Your skepticism is invalid. Like, this is what the pros do. And you should too. Playful prototypes can be really powerful tools for answering a lot of questions in really quick and non-intrusive ways with low overhead of time and money. So other types of game prototypes are physical prototypes. So the game kind of abstracted down into a board or a card game or a role-playing game. One doesn't have to be the whole game, like I mentioned with the Metroid prototype from spring 2022. That was just the Emmy chase mode. So it's like a chunk of the game. They didn't make all of Metroid Dread. And they only really, and the level was not one-to-one. It was kind of like abstracted into this sort of, buildable as you play board, so that, it would kind of feel like the first time you run into one of these rooms, you get kind of lost. You make one feature per prototype or at a time, what that will do. So like, don't try to build the whole thing before you play it. Build one thing at a time, even if it doesn't feel like a game yet. You know, you want to think like, well, is it cooler to have the pieces move with a like set speed stat, like every turn you move 3, or is it cool? Does it feel better to do roll to move? And you know, you'll like move a piece that way and then take it back and then roll a die, move the piece that way and see how it feels. That's not a game, but that is a prototype, and it does answer your questions about like, oh, it is more satisfying to have pieces of different speed stats or something like that, because that makes my strategic, you know, options more interesting. You've just figured something out about your video game that can be very powerful. You know, different units have different speed stats. You know, you might think, oh, that's obvious, but you know, or you might think, well, of course that happens in insert game here. I'll just say Team Fortress 2. But you know, cool, it worked for Team Fortress 2. Does it work for you? This can help you figure that out. You know, and again, it can be game modes, interfaces, things like that. These are just examples of things people have made in previous courses of mine, including, again, they can be kind of wide-ranging prototype things. Like here's one prototype where somebody made a game where you like shoot with a Nerf gun as part of the prototype. It was super fun. But then there's digital prototypes. So like once you've answered a few questions, sometimes there are going to be things that, yes, you need to do in a interface. So that's where you do digital prototyping. One, they should be rough. You know, I always hear from students, well, how nice should a prototype look before you show it to somebody? And I always say like, well, you know, did you open a Unity file and you have the default cube in the kind of blue sky space? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, great, show it to somebody. You know, and they think I'm being facetious, but I'm not. Like, it's okay for it to be as rough as humanly possible. This picture is a little bit of a cheat because the abstract art look was actually the game's aesthetic. But, you know, it's that type of thing where it's okay to have simplistic programmer graphics, or graphics not made to look very nice, just purely functional, that aren't the final graphics, so that you can understand, is the jump nice? Are my physics good? Does this enemy behavior work? Things like that. It also doesn't need to be in the final in-game engine. Again, sometimes you can learn something more quickly by using a simple, often some of these no-code engines like your Constructs, your Game Makers, your Twines, your GB Studios, that'll help you understand things like, you could do the flow of quests in a little GB Studio adventure or something like that. And then playtesting. Playtest all the time. No, really. With strangers, that's the thing students don't always feel comfortable doing. But you're going to get really good at your game. You're going to stop seeing it objectively. So you need fresh eyes and people who've never played it before, friends, family, random strangers on the street or in the dining hall. They're great. So have roommates, friends of roommates, enemies of roommates, enemies of friends, or your enemies. If you have enemies, don't have enemies. But that's like you want people who've not played it yet. Take notes, take copious notes, and then respond to feedback trends, not individual ideas unless they're like really good. So you're not looking, if somebody says like, this game is confusing in this way, but that's the only person that says that. That's only like one person. And the reason that they think it's confusing might be like, oh, are you sure? And everybody else is like, this is actually very intuitive. Maybe that game is not for that individual, and that's okay. But if like 20, 50, 100 people say that, well, guess what? It's time to go fix it. So look for trends, not for individual pieces of feedback when you do this. Gathering data. Make a playtest questionnaire, and in the resource website for the Playful Production Process book, there is actually some playtest questionnaires that you can use. That's why we have things like textbooks that have accompanying websites. They're very useful. But the playtest questionnaire, that's a really good tool that you can use to get information about things you want to learn through your playtesting. So, if you have no questionnaire and no structure, people will just like give you ideas. They'll be like, what if your character had a gun and then they could like do this stuff? And you're like, well, I don't think that's gonna help in my world hunger fighting, my world hunger like fixing game, like advocacy game. But so people just like spit random ideas at you. Having a questionnaire kind of makes them answer the questions you care about. And what I found is that, if you are making a commercial game, how much would you pay for this is a nice question, because actually usually you're going to get an answer that indicates that, what you're thinking of, people might actually want to pay more for, which is great news for you. And then you have a space for any other thoughts. That's where people can like give you the feedback that they're itching to tell you, because whoa, video game, I can like give ideas to video game developers. Have that space for any other thoughts, so people can like vent that, but because you're doing it in writing in like a questionnaire format, either typing into like an iPad with a Survey Monkey or something, or actual pencil and paper, they can't just like spout stuff at you. It's like, okay, we're gonna write 3 sentences, and I gotta go see the next game. So it's a way to control those like spammy comments. And then also, maybe like offer them like, hey, email to join the mailing list again if you're trying to build an audience. So that's ideation. The next is pre-production. So the deliverables of pre-production are, you want to make what's called a vertical slice, and you want to make what's called a game design macro. Now we're going to go over what those are in a little bit. But the practices that get you there. So this is where our class, most of our classes kind of fit, because pre-production or research can, you're probably looking at like maybe in an ideal environment, like maybe 6 months. Pre-production, you might be looking at, depending how long people are working there, that could be 6 months or it could be like years. It really depends on like what the size of your game is and who the developers are, and are you people that's your day job, or are you people that are working nights and weekends? Nights and weekends projects, if a project's nights and weekend, the timeline stretches because you have fewer person hours to devote to the game every day. So I'm avoiding giving time frames of how long these things take, because that's subject to so many factors. But production methods that we can use to still, even in these other, different timelines, manage include Scrum, Agile, and Waterfall. Again, we focus on these 2 stages a lot because that's what you end up doing in a classroom environment. Is this, ideation and pre-production, because most of what you build in classes is what you would call a vertical slice, which is if you take a small piece of a game, but you put as many, you put features in it such that it feels like a complete game experience, but maybe like kind of in a level or so, or a small space. Like a short demo. And what that will do is it's your way to show somebody like a publisher, this is what our game experience is going to be. Again, that can take many months, and that's why, in a 5-month project, like a class project, that's about what you're targeting. So this is where, this is about what you get into in a classroom environment. And again, a lot of young designers if you are just sort of like, okay, I'm gonna make a game, click open, assumed engine, and then like just start hammering a game out with no structure, that is where things like group work fall apart, because you're not really thinking of it in terms of phases of production. You're just kind of like, I'm gonna like run around with my hair on fire until a game hopefully drops out by the end of the semester. But we can take control of this. We can actually own this process and be happier, healthier human beings. So the practice is, again, Scrum, Agile, Waterfall. I'll go over what those are. Concentric development, and obviously you're going to test. The other thing you want to do during this phase is establish a schedule for yourself. So what do I mean by these development structures? Well, what these are ways to structure and schedule the day-to-day work or week-to-week work of making your piece of software. And I say it that way because like that's what it is, and that's where these practices come from. They come from more general software development. Now, Waterfall I want to cover, not because I think you should use it, but because it's a thing you're going to hear, it's a thing you're going to encounter. And there are times to use Waterfall. It's not necessarily for projects like this, and I'll explain why. But it's a linear process where steps are not moved on until the current step is finalized and verified. That's usually what students kind of trap themselves into, or students or young designers. It's just kind of like working from A to B to C to C to E and so on. And the problem with that, they kind of come up with like what the requirements are. They analyze the external factors at play. They come up with what the thing is going to be, on paper. So it's like a design document. And then again, you just start like, you code the thing. You're like, game making. And then at the end of making the whole thing, you test and then you put it out. And then again, that's what projects that I've seen not do that well have done. And here's why I mention this, because like I've seen young designers, fall into the trap of like, you assume that, okay, what's the due date at the end of the semester? Okay, I will have something by then. And then every week you don't have, you fall into the trap of like not having something. I had a really busy week, so I didn't get any work done on it. But I'll have some development done by next week. You're thinking of it like, I've got to just work through it until the end date. You're not thinking in terms of, I'm going to have a playable chunk here and then test it, and then a playable chunk here and then test it. So you're not really like checking in on it like you would with other things. So that's one of the cons of Waterfall. You're not iterating. You're not like testing it midway through. If you ever cook anything, real chefs will tell you, taste what you're cooking. And the reason they tell you that is that, if you only taste what you're cooking when it's served and it's bad, it's just bad. You can't go back and fix it most of the time. But if you taste it while you're cooking it, as long as obviously it's safe while you're cooking it, you don't want to taste raw meat and be like, oh, this is good hamburger. But if you taste it while you're cooking, then you'll know, oh, I need a little bit more salt. Okay, and you put a little bit more salt, and then it's better. It'll come out better. So that's what Waterfall doesn't do. This is cooking that dish without tasting it ever. The pros are that problems are researched early. Time and money can be spent laying a good foundation for the project, then troubleshooting the project. But it's really only good for structured projects where there are a lot of knowns. If you're making a sequel, you can consider Waterfall because it's like, oh, well, we already figured out what our game's core gameplay is. We just need to make more. But maybe we like do some iterative development on like the new features, but then we just kind of like, once we get those, we can through. So again, if you're making a new idea, which you are mostly every semester at this point, you don't want to use So like when you don't want to use waterfall if there's a lot of unknowns, which there are in most of your projects. The next is agile. I just wanted to show you what the like agile manifesto is. It's based on this like manifesto. But so I'm not going to read this because I just wanted you to see how it's kind of based on this like series of statements. But really what agile is based on is this idea of you're creating this set of features. You're like planning out a set of features and creating a list of like what you're actually going to build, and then you have these iterative sprints that create the opportunity for instead of trying to focus on like making the whole thing, you say I'm going to work on the user interface, and then you focus on that chunk, and then after you've like built a prototype of that chunk, you test it, and then you see, is it effective and ready to go, or do you see like this needs more time? So it's based on these sprints. And Agile is the home, Agile birthed this other methodology that your classes are actually based on, which is called Scrum. And Scrum, you've heard me talk about this, is a process in which you plan out your project and you create what's called the backlog. That's like the wish list of features or elements that you want in the project. And what you do is, so you have the whole project backlog. That's like your list of all the features in your game. Then what you do is you're going to start working in sprints, which are a week, 2 weeks-ish amounts of time usually. But basically that's a concentrated period of work where you and your coworkers are basically going to create a sprint backlog. So you're going to take some of the features from the whole list, you're going to put it into, here's the list for this sprint. And then you're going to divide these features up, divide and conquer. So again, this works well when, and you've heard me say this, everybody on the team has distinct jobs. If you have distinct jobs, then this is easier to do. Oh, this feature is related to the scripting of the game, so this should be given to the programmer. This is related to the art, you should give this to the artist. So you could take something like, build the prototype of movement, build the, do some concept art, get a sound library, et cetera, and you can start to like distribute these things to your team. So once you've established what everybody's going to work on during the sprint, then you go and sprint. You have X amount of time that you've agreed on for the sprint, and you work on the thing. And then at the end of the sprint, you come together. You can also do a thing called a daily scrum, which is a daily check-in. And I would recommend doing that in the structure you're in. Like, try to make time to at least everybody must check, your group Discord or something like that. If you can even have a phone call, that's the best. But in other stages, it's really just good to be like, hey, I worked on this today. And that can be really useful so that everybody, A, keeps motivated, but B, you have like a daily sort of affirmation of working on the project. But at the end of the sprint, you're going to have another structured meeting. And again, the class that this is for is structured on this. Every week is your Scrum check-in, or what you might call a delta meeting, which stands for like what changed, because delta in math is the change between two states. So you have your Scrum meeting, and that's where you review the work done. You test it, you play it, you might use that as an opportunity to have somebody else play it, but you confirm whether things are ready to go, or if they need to go back into the backlog for the next sprint, and if stuff is done, it can be shipped or complete and just put it into the project. If it's not done, you put it into the backlog for the next sprint, and then you grab what else okay, so this one needs more time in the oven, these other things are done, now let's take some other features from the project backlog, put them into this sprint's backlog, rinse and repeat until you have a game. That's what Scrum is. Scrum works well because you're constantly testing and iterating. And it works really well for these types of projects. It also has built into it the sort of like divide and conquer mentality of everybody takes this chunk. Where Waterfall doesn't really. Waterfall is a little more like run around with your hair on fire until the deadline. It doesn't have to be, but like Scrum codifies the stuff that I think a lot of people have trouble intuiting about structured design. So vertical slice, like I said, it's a small slice of your game that has all the relevant features. Not the first level. Don't make the first level. The first level is usually for tutorials, and the tendency of designers is to make, the first thing you make is sort of like, we're going to make the kitchen sink, and that's usually good for like a level 3 or 4. That's not what your vertical slice is, or that's not what your first level is. Your vertical slice is like the showcase of the things in your game. So level 1, you're probably actually going to make towards the end of the project because that's when you know what you need to teach the player because you play tested. But it should include the entirety of the core game loop. If the core game loop of your game, the core thing, and in the case of transformational games, the transformational component, that should exist in your vertical slice. Because I know some people like only add the transformational aspect as like art at the end. Don't do that. Make sure that it's in art or text or something in that vertical slice so that people can see this is what transformational aspects the game has. So you try to be as complete as possible, but sometimes you don't have everything. I've made vertical slices where not all the gameplay features are in, but like I have hints of them, where it becomes apparent, so you can talk about like, hey, and this is something we're planning on implementing. We really love assistance with this, so that we could, with the funding, we can hire somebody to help this get this out faster, et cetera, et cetera. Or maybe you do have like an army of programmers and you don't have a ton of art help right now. Maybe your game is more or less like has all the features and they're really cool, but your art's not great. Maybe so in those cases, you might craft what's called a beautiful corner. The game is all in gray box prototype, but one small area has final art so that you can show off, and this is what our vision for the artwork is. So those are different ways to deal with the missing pieces. So that you can still create an engaging vertical slice. So the vertical slice, like I said, that's most of what you have at the end of the semester, because that's really what there's time for. So the next thing that's a deliverable is what's called the game design macro. It's a stripped down game design document. And it's basically, Lemarchand calls it a matrix of ideas that represents an overview of the game's design. It has 2 parts. A short, which is 5 to 20 pages, design overview summary that lists fundamental gameplay features, most important unique mechanics, and an outline of the game's plot. It's like a short-form game design document. And it can be just kind of in an outline form. The structure of that is kind of loose. It's just really sort of like a pitch document. But the big one, one that you have lots of formats for is what's called the macro chart. And it's a spreadsheet with step-by-step breakdown of the game, the activities, the story beats, the levels, and things like that. So I mentioned that I was going to talk about tools that will help you in this. I did kind of screw that up on talking about Scrum. If you are going to use Scrum, and well, actually, when you use Scrum, because the class is Scrum, I would recommend for your groups using what's called a Kanban board. And if you're unfamiliar with that term, you might be familiar with the website Trello. Now, Trello, by default, uses, like, basically, a Trello or a Kanban board is where you take your project backlog, like all the features you want, and you put them into the list of to-do items, and then you take those to-do pieces, each feature, and you put them into the in-progress thing, and you assign them to somebody. You tag somebody on it, and you assign them to it. And then your sprint, that's when you're doing your thing. And then after your sprint, you take that thing, you put it into in review. And these are just like, these are, if you have one of the default options in Trello is to actually have these columns already built. So like, the list of features in process, in review, done. So you take that thing that's in process, you go to your Delta meeting, you put that in review. If it needs more time, you put it back in progress. But then if it's done, you move it into done, and then you get like cool confetti firing out, because Trello is awesome like that. So use Trello to manage your Scrum process and your sprints. That's a huge pro tip. But the other thing is, frankly, Excel. My goodness, spreadsheets, Excel or Google Sheets, they're amazing. What can you do with them? Everything. You can technically make games in them. But, the macro is really a step-by-step spreadsheet breakdown of the game activities and story beats and levels. So this is one of the macros from Uncharted 2 that LeMarchand talks about in the book. But basically, so you see each row is a level. Well, actually, several rows are in a level. So there's the level, and they're color-coded, but then each part of the level has its own row. But in the row, you're going to see a breakdown of like what its look is, what time of day it is, who's your ally or important NPC, what enemy models are in there, what kind of gameplay verbs are in each scene, because you're not like putting all the verbs everywhere. One level might be more exploration, another might be more action. And then you have like, it says macro overflow, kind of like, okay, what is this trying to accomplish? And then they even have this little matrix, it says player mechanics. Each mechanic is a column, and then you just kind of like X off which mechanics are used in that level. Some of them are used everywhere because they're the core mechanics, like free climbing. So that's used everywhere, but like, something like, free ropes, monkey bars, things like that, they're not everywhere. So I'll let you look through this. Also weapons, it says. You can track what weapons, what enemies, things like that. There are templates for this in your textbook. I'm not going to labor on the description too much, but basically it is the entire spreadsheet roadmap of the game. It's the thing that tells you, oh, this level is going to have this weapon in it. And that's super useful. I don't know why I have two of this form, but I do. So if you need a reminder of what game design macro is, there you go. The next is a schedule. Oh, it's so fun. I bet you thought this is exactly what you were going to do in game development school. But this is how you manage your project. You want to do a nice schedule. Schedule, simply breakdown of the time frame you will use to make the game. But how do we even start to make a schedule? Well, first of all, you need to calculate the person hours available in your game project. How do we do that? First of all, you take T. So to figure out T, which is the time to make the game, you multiply N, the number of your team members, by P, the person hours each team member will have to work on the game in an average week. So, how much time should you work on the game in a week? So, I'll give an example in a second. And then you multiply those also by W, number of weeks between the end of pre-production and the end of full production, which for our sake, so the formula here is simply T equals N times P times W. So think about it this way. T, the time you have to make the project, is, so let's say it's a project in this class. You have 4 team members, probably. You might have four. You might have 4, 5. Some teams are bigger. But you have, like, let's say, again, 4 team members as an example. And let's say each of those team members does the recommended 6 to 9 hours outside of a class that is recommended to, like, function in a class. So let's say everybody's able to do the 9 hours, the maximum of that, because you're super organized and structured and you devote what you can to doing really well in your classes. So you have 4 people times 9 person hours per week times, at the time you're watching this lecture, there are probably like 8.5 to 9 hours, or 8.5 to 9 weeks left of the course. So 4 times 9 is 324 person hours until the end of the semester. So that is how many person hours there are to finish the game. That is your limit. And what you do is then you just start cutting up those person hours and saying, this feature is going to take, I'm going to estimate 8 hours to do, this feature is going to take 16 hours to do, and then you start building a schedule spreadsheet of like what that's going to look like. So this one is a little more expanded from what you're doing, but this is a early schedule we did for Nemo. It actually even includes expected salaries for people, and this is something you might use to pitch to a publisher. But instead of person hours, we are going in person months. So, you look at, for example, the top tier here shows like what roles are in each of these, are active in each of these stages of development. And we kind of go by like, here's when we're building the Mushroom Forest, here's when we're building Slumberland, here's when we're building the Night Sky level, et cetera, et cetera. And we think about how many team members are we going to need at those periods. So if you see a 1, that means it's like we need a full-time. If you have a 0.5, that means it's a part-time. But that's where you're going to see like we need this many people on the development team at these points. But you see like the early stages, 2, 2.5, 3, so on and so forth. But when you get to the end, that's called you need to ramp up. That's when it's like, okay, we need a bigger team. We need a 7, 8, 9 person team. So that's what that's saying. But in our man months, we say like, okay, these are the stages we expect to be in these months. So you can see that broken down by like features in a level and a list of like assets to be made. We at the bottom, we estimate what the salary for those people for those roles are going to be, and obviously multiply that by how many people we need in those roles, and how many months we need, and then that becomes our budget. So this is not only schedule, but it's also budget. But this is what a schedule can look like. You kind of say, in this week or this month, we are going to produce these things, and these are the milestones we are going to hit. So we're going to try to have these things all complete. And usually, again, thinking of Scrum, want to structure this in milestones. So you know that at a certain point, you are going to have this list of features done. At the next point, you have this list of features done. This is what publishers will actually do for you. And when I say for you, I mean, like, these are the things that publishers hold developers to when they pay for the development of a game. And it usually comes into like, if you hit this milestone, that's when you get your next round of funding. So this is why deadlines are important. And this is also why I make sure that you hit your deadlines so that you don't bankrupt a studio in the future by not thinking deadlines are important. There's also in your book a concept called a burn down chart. Now this is a different kind of schedule. It can be kind of confusing at first, but this is a really great way to track your scrums, your individual like sprints. So think about it this way. You got 3 things here. You've got the developer sheet. So you got developer, each one gets a nickname designation for quick typing in, but you list how many hours available they have during the week, how many person hours they have to devote to the thing. So then you track, okay, well, what features are we working on during this sprint, and what like priority do they have? So you're going to list the features you're going to work on during the sprint, and then you're going to give them a priority. Priority 1 should be things like core game mechanics, core art, stuff like that. Priority 2, you're probably looking at some like tertiary game mechanics, or building a system that's going to be good to have, but not really. It's not the core game loop. And then feature 3 is like extras, and like, ooh, if we can add this particle effect to this thing, we should do it. So you track how many like 1s, 2s, 3s you have for the week, and then you say you estimate how many hours it's going to take that week, or how many hours you estimate it's going to take for that task to be done. So like, let's say feature 1, and LeMarchand recommends working in 1, 2, 4, and 8 hour chunks, just to keep things kind of like consistent and allow for some like, oh, this actually took like an hour and a half because it's, it was a little harder than I thought and there was a bug. It kind of, these bigger swaths of time let you have that flexibility of like, oh, a bug happened. So, you want to, you estimate how many hours it's going to take. You say who it's assigned to. And then so like this is the burn chart for like a week, for like next week during the Monday through Friday, right? And so, what this schedule is not, so if you look at row 1 where it says feature 1, priority 1, hours estimated assigned to Adam, 10:10. That's not that Adam worked for 8 hours on that feature. It's that there are 8 hours, that day, Adam said there are 8 hours of work left on this. So he checked in with a daily check-in and said there are 8 hours of work. There's still 8 hours of work left on this feature. So it was 8 hours estimated to be worked on. He logged it in on Monday because maybe he didn't work on it that day. He had to go to his day job and stuff like that, right? And it was really ramped up at day job. So he didn't get to work on it, so there's still 8 hours left. Same with Tuesday, that's his big class day or something. But Wednesday, oh man, he had like a really productive day. So he got in a bunch of hours of work. And this isn't tracking how many hours he actually worked on it. Maybe it was 3, maybe it was 4, maybe it was 7 somehow. But, he did a bunch of work on it, and he's like, I bet there's about 4 hours left. So that's what he tracks on there. So again, it's how many hours you think are left estimated on that feature that you're working on. So you say, okay, there's 4 hours left. Maybe you got to work on it a little bit the next day, and like, so I was like, I couldn't really get anywhere. It was fighting me a little bit too much. There's still 4 hours left. The next day, you got more work done, but maybe it wasn't quite done, so you estimated 2 hours. So at the end of the week, you say this big priority still probably has about 2 hours left on it. So again, this has nothing to do with the actual hours Adam put in. It's him checking in with that feature that he's responsible for every day, estimating this is how much is left until it's done. And that's how it goes. So you see here, like, this gets into the idea of, we talked about iterations in a sprint and how sometimes you have a feature where you put it into the backlog for the next sprint. This is a good way to track that. So now you have a way to say, these features are done because we got them down to 0 and we feel like they're pretty well complete, versus these ones need a little more time in the oven. So that's what this is doing. You're not tracking how much time each person worked on it. You're tracking burning down the time left on the features. And that's a good way of visualizing how features carry over from one sprint to the next and keeping your sprints organized. Because now you know that Ben and Denise maybe have some extra time because they were able to get their features done. And again, that's not a judgment on them as time managers. That's maybe like, again, Adam was working on like the character physics and like, gosh, we all know those can take forever. So again, useful during sprints. going to try to crank this out because I've got to go here in a second to get to teaching class in person. But phase 3 is full production. The deliverables you want in this are the game in beta form, and you want to start planning for marketing. Here you're going to do testing, you're going to collect metrics, and you want to understand what it means for features versus content. So you're going to hear the term alpha and beta a lot. Now, alpha is usually considered by many to be feature complete. That means all the mechanisms, the interface, the stuff that makes the game up, those are complete. But maybe all those things only exist in like level 1 or like, a sample level. So it's not that the game has all of the levels and all of the story. It's that they have the story system and the characters and the enemies and, navigation and the map system and the interface and, all that material that are the features of the game, but not, level 1, level 2, level 3, big cutscene, blah, 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 blah. Beta is when you have all the content done, but maybe it's like still buggy. So, all the content is completed in beta. That's when you have all your levels, all your characters, all your story. But like, maybe not all the cutscenes are done or something like that. And again, buggy. But then again, you build marketing plans. But, you usually work with a marketer on that. So testing, like prototyping, but more formal. The book talks about informal testing, which is playing by yourself or with your team in the office. Like, make a thing, try it out. Make a thing, try it out. And then formal testing are inviting audience members to test in a controlled environment. You're always going to be doing informal testing, but that does not replace the testing with the people coming in from the outside, because you're going to get too good at your game. You're going to stop to see it objectively. User testing, you'll hear about this. What's the difference between that and formal testing? That's usually focused on design and interfaces, so that's user experience design. It's a term borrowed from UX or user experience design. But it's not like, hey, let's bring these gamers into this room and watch them from behind glass. That's what formal testing is. It's almost like a psych test. But you want to give them that like undisturbed play testing so that you can see their reaction to it. QA, it's a whole career line that you can get into in game development, but broadly, it's you test for bugs and technical problems and you track them to submit to the development team. So that the development team can go back and like find the bugs. So QA people are basically like, they play the game in a way that no normal human being would, so that they can find all the collision bugs, all the things that will make the game glitch out and stop functioning, so that you don't release the game with a terrible bug. Automated testing is the use of software to test the quality of code. It has a place to make sure your code is clean. And then public-facing testing, that's either something like a Steam Early Access or a public beta, where you're putting it out to the public and they test it by virtue of either like an online feedback form or, in-game analytics. So in-game analytics are part of what we call metrics, which is recording telemetry data during gameplay to optimize your game's experience or test for balance. So a popular form of this telemetry is a heat map, where you might have a game where, like, as they play, you track where players died and how often. Mario Maker actually has telemetry data in it. If you ever play Mario Maker, it'll show you where the death points are, so that can help you see maybe space out your jumps differently or something like that, because that becomes like a point of difficulty for people. It can show where the hot spots are for like where players go to fight in a deathmatch level. It can show where players get stuck and maybe spend too much time. It can show where it can show like, our difficulty curve is really wonky because there's lots of deaths on level 2, but level 3 doesn't have these many obstacles and players get through really fast. So you start to see like where issues are. You can all observe this if you do it in controlled playtests, but this is extra data that actually turns this into numbers. It's really cool. So I'm not trying to do Talos Interactive's, advertising for them for this plugin for the Unreal Engine, but like you'll find plugins, and sometimes engines actually just have this in them. I know Unity has some of these features in it by default, but you can also get plugins for engines that'll help you record things like how much time a player took in a specific place, how much time they spent in a location, how many times they were killed, how many times, the percentage of times they were able to reach objectives, things like that. It's really good. But that's what you can use those metrics to help you, change your gameplay. Now you're going to hear again alpha, beta, and release. Alpha is, again, that is the state at which your features are done, but the gameplay and, the game might not even be very nice looking at this point. You probably don't even have all your final art in, but the game works. And now it may be very buggy, but it works, and it has all the features in a raw form. But you start testing in alpha with like a small group of people, and you want to use that group of people to like, okay, we have these ideas, now let's crystallize how to turn them into broader content and better design. And in doing so, you're going to have, you're going to know like what the next steps to take are, like how do we use these systems we've built, and where are the bugs in that system. Beta, you're going to let a few more people in, and that's when content's complete. But again, maybe not all the art is 100% right. You've got some bugs. You're playtesting to find those bugs and squash them. But that is when you are content complete. And the game is like a little neater, a little more close to the final vision. But if you see public betas online, you might see like where it's all in textured or in gray box still and things like that. Release is when it's in the world. You've bug tested, you've fixed most of the things, and it's in the world. Which brings us to, oh my gosh, don't discount, Phase 4, I forgot Phase 4, because everybody does. Post-production. What is this, post-production? Well, post-production is all the stuff you didn't think you were going to do when you became a game developer. Bug fixing, polishing, balancing, talking about like what is the milestone, what does it mean to have a release candidate, but then also console certification, unexpected game design, what are those things? And then eventually it's out. Because we thought, oh man, the game's ready, I finished it, I finished the content, it's out, right? Nope. Because sometimes when you finish the content, your game's going to get real big, and it's going to kind of creak a little bit under its own size. And maybe things that weren't actually working that effectively are suddenly going to show you that they're not working that effectively. I literally dealt with this the other night, where I was like, oh, my game's almost content complete. Great. Wait, why does my character animation stutter if I in certain spots in certain rooms? When he goes through triggers to make my map coordinate system work, that makes the animation stutter and the game speed stutter if he's attacking while also moving. That's an extremely specific situation, but that's what you find out. Those are the bugs you find. And you're like, I can't have that. So I had to rewrite a prototype of the mapping system, that's what's on the image here, to account for that. I found that at beta. That's been there the entire time, but it's only when the project became as big as it's going to be that it really manifested. So that's the kind of stuff that you want to figure out when you're at this stage. Polishing, adding extra elements that make the game look, sound, or feel better. If you've been doing a good job of trying to catch bugs throughout, and nobody's perfect, but you can also spend this time polishing, which means like adding that little extra animation, adding the little extra, flourish or, particle effect or something like that makes the game just kind of feel shinier and better. But watch out, that may make extra bugs. So, beware. Balancing, quite simply, tuning the difficulty or mechanics of the game to make the game consistently engaging. Working on those difficulty curves. This is why you take those telemetry measurements, because you can see, level 2 is really hard. Maybe we adjust the enemy AI or their attack rate or their their health in level 2 so it's not so severe and it makes it easier. That's the kind of stuff you do to balance games. Ian Schreiber, an expert on game balance and author of the book Game Balance, along with Brenda Romero, says perhaps an oversimplification, but we can think of game balance as mostly about figuring out what numbers to use in a game. Can be done throughout development, certainly, but is aided by information collected and play tested at milestones and through metric testing. So a few quick notes on release candidate in gold. That is the version that is complete in terms of features and content. You've polished it, you've balanced it somewhat, as much as you can. All of these are as much as you can because, something rushed out by Christmas, maybe it doesn't do all this. And some of you are looking at this and thinking, well, but what about insert game name here? Those were rushed out because we live in an era where you can day one DLC to fix things, or DLC later to fix things. A recent, at the time of this recording, version of this is Cyberpunk, or No Man's Sky, where everybody's like, oh, it didn't work in these ways on day one. Well, guess what? After more time in the oven, it's become smoothed out. Beware, that can create lots of bad faith for early adopters. If you are making something like a retro homebrew game or something like that, you don't have that luxury. If Kudzu is broken and I didn't pick up a game-breaking bug, all cartridges of Kudzu out there are borked, and I can't go around with my laptop reflashing everybody's carts. So watch this. Do as much as you can. Within your capabilities. But sometimes the capabilities is a guy in a suit, breathing down your neck, being like, we got to get this out for Christmas. So testing long enough that you think you found all major bugs, all bugs that the game can't ship with that are like major bugs, you try to fix them. And then ones that you decide to fix, you just close their files in the QA tracking tool that you're doing. You just let that, because games ship with bugs. Gold is when the game is ready to be released publicly after release candidate is tested even more. So you do the release candidate, you test the heck out of that too, but again, sometimes games ship with bugs. Game certification, requirements that a game must meet before it can be released on a platform. This includes technical requirements, quality control, so again, the QA process, but also like security. What if there's malware in it? Content, making sure the content's right. So there's this meme that is a very good encapsulation of what console cert versus PC cert is. PC cert, it's a little Shiba Inu, says thank you for not uploading malware. Console cert, Nintendo rejects you because you use the word joystick instead of analog stick. That happens. That's not a joke. It's just a joke because it's in this meme, but that's the thing. So that's what the content means. Implementation of game systems, making sure that you're using all the right achievement systems, things like that. The branding's right, the logos are right. Are you using the right licensed by Nintendo, et cetera, et cetera. I'm picking on Nintendo, but that's where you hear all the really specific cert things. Did you get ESRB rating and all that other stuff? I bet you never thought about having to get your game the ESRB rating, but you do. That's all the stuff you have to do to release a game in these places. And then, of course, unexpected game design. All the stuff you didn't think game designers did. Making a trailer. Submitting your game for content ratings. So again, ESRB. Making the demo version. Oh, what about the demo version? You made the game, but what about the demo? How are you going to do that? Is it level 1 and then it cuts off to be continued, play the game? Or is it kind of a rejiggered greatest hits version of the game, like I've seen on some games? Does your game have a website? What about publicity? Have you been emailing the press? Have you made a press kit so the press has Like, doesn't have to collect screenshots from your game. You can just give them screenshots and trailers. Did you make the trailer again? Do you have social media accounts? Did you do interviews with Games Press? How's that strategy guide going? You know, the people at, I don't think Prima still makes strategy guides, but the people at like, you know, Fangamer, they don't play your game all the way through to make the strategy guide. You give them the walkthrough and they make it pretty. That's how strategy guides work. I'm working on one right now. You know, are you ready to be in the making of documentary? Have you scheduled that time to sit down with the documentarian who's doing the documentary? Did you submit to Boston Fig to show at an expo? Cleveland Gaming Classic, you've got your table reservation. You know, stuff like that. And again, transformational game, did you submit your paper to Meaningful Play or another transformational game conference so that you can you know, take part in that kind of outreach and showcasing for your game? Or, you know, did you submit your postmortem to GDC? So those are the kind of things that people don't think about, but they're really important in the game development process. And that's part of game development. Cool. I'm gonna have to go, but real quick, week 6 project assignment, transformational framework. You're going to make a transformational framework document for your game. It's not anything really formal. It's just I want you to go through the questions in the transformational framework book that are at the beginning of each chapter and answer them for your game. This should be pretty easy because it's already stuff you've done in your paper. I just want you to actually write it down in those terms for yourself and for me because you're turning it in so that I can see you've thought through these processes. That's it. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you in class.